Okay, I'm back again. So now it's time, after all that drafting and saying goodbye to everyone, to have a look at what the results were of these drafts. You'll notice, if you're watching the YouTube version, that there is some colours to tell us where players have come from. So these are, each one of these sheets, or these tiles if you want to call it, is for every single team. We're going to go through it in the alphabetical order I've got here. So the first team is the North Sydney Bears. All the players in this green colour are the protected 13. All the players in the blue are the drafted 7. Then there is the yellowish colour, or orangey yellow, which is the players that were in the bid. Now that's either in that commotion of bid that we just did, or the auto bidding that happened afterwards to get everyone to 30 players. And the purplish colour is trade. There's only been 3 trades, so there's not going a lot of clubs aren't affected by the trade, but we'll go sort of through it. So North Sydney, so you've got Fritz, Hall, Horder, Icon, Lation, McLean, Moore, Roy, Rutgerson, Taylor, Williams, Wilson and Yeo as the protected players. They drafted Andrew G, Clinton O'Brien, Travis Baker, Danny Farrow, Brett Galea, Nathan Long and Jody Rudd. And I'm not going to go through everyone, but notice Justin Morgan, Jeremy Schloss, some good players. Then this is just over here where it says retired. That was the players who retired in 1997. That was to help out these guys who were drafting. So we've got a finished, or a top 17 squad. Willie McLean at fullback, David Hall and Nigel Roy in the centre and the wingers, Wilson and Yeo in the centres, Icon and Taylor at the halves. Then it's Fritz, Farrow and G up front, Justin Morgan, Danny Williams and Billy Moore at the back row. And the bench is Lation, Schloss, O'Brien and Long. So that's interesting side. We'll move on to the Broncos. So like I said, I'm not going to read all these out, but they did obviously kept players like Lockyer and Ranoff, Brad Thorne, guys like that, Webke, and they, there's a few others there you can see. They also kept Anthony Mundine, which was an interesting one. I end up, as you can tell, or as you can hear, I ended up doing the drafting for Mickey, who had done this, and his basic instruction was to try and get as many Broncos players, and then he gave me a big list of all the other guys he wanted. So we ended up with these players in blue, Butterfield and Elsgood and Bonetti. They just needed a bit in that areas. Interestingly, the draft, they ended up with Paul Carriage, and Mark Glanville. There were some interesting ones. So their finished team, we're going to keep Lockyer at fullback. So we've got Lockyer at fullback, Hancock and Elsgood on the wings, Renoff and Darren Smith in the centres, Mundine and Walker as the halves, or that's Ben Walker, Petro Sivanasiva, Shane Webke and Simon Benetti as the front row, Thorne, Butterfield and Philip Lee as the back row, and then it's John Plath, Mark Lanville, Michael DeVere and Dennis Scott. So that's an interesting squad again. Let's see if that's the team that could win 1998 as it did in reality. We're going to move across to the Bulldogs. So here's the Bulldogs team. I think the biggest shock for me was the fact that they decided to draft Clint Shivkovsky. They didn't protect Rod Silver, so they've, from my mind, got an upgrade, but very interesting sort of side. If we have a look, we've got some other drafting things there, but nothing really majorly in the bidding that anyone's going to worry too much about. They got a bit of cover there with Dean Moon at fullback. So their best 17 is Clint Shevkovsky, Hazan Al-Masri, Craig Hancock on the wings, Paul Meller and Willie Talau in the centres, Gene Namu and Craig Paul Mounder are the halves. Then it's Darren Britt, Jason Hetherington, Stephen Price. Then it's Steve Reardon, Robert Ralph and Tony Grimaldi, with Corey Hughes, Shane Martini, Jason Stevens and Adam Muir on the bench. A lot of these are selected by the drafters, but I didn't get anything back from Cliffy. So this is the best team I can think of. When I do benches in this era, I give them a utility half, a utility back, a front rower, and a second rower. So that's why I've got that in that way. There's probably a few other guys who can make their way into this side, but yeah, that's how we've put it, and should be very interesting. Next one's the Cowboys. So that's AJ's team there. Some big pickups in the drafting. Tallis and Fairley, I think, were huge. Matthew Rodwell's a great pickup, and Robbie McCormack as a bid is very, very interesting. The fact he was still there is a very interesting thing. So their best side, this is the way that he's put it in. He's got Peter Jorgensen at fullback, Ray Mercy and Josh Hainer on the wings, Bauman and Barry John Mather in the centres. He's got Jason Ferris at 5'8", Matthew Riddle at halfback. Then the front row is Lomax, Deeth and Stewart, with Tallis, Mamando and Fairley in the back row, and then Sid Eru, Tony Tumavavi, Brennan Hurst and Owen Cunningham. So lots and lots of cover for hookers, I think. Oh, not lots and lots of covers, sorry, there's a little bit of cover for hooker. The fact that I mentioned McCormack and he doesn't even make it into the team is pretty interesting. So yeah, we'll see how those boys from Townsville do. Next up's the Dragons. So interestingly for me, Scotty Mann getting drafted. Not too much interesting happening. There's Phil Howlett, some other guys here, Darren Higgins, Darren Willis. The bidding didn't really do much for the Dragons, but their best team is Scott Mann at fullback, and then Blacklock and Vangana on the wings. That's Nigel Vangana. The centres are Coyne and Ainscough. I'm not sure. I probably would swap Ainscough and Vangana, but that's the way that he's put it in there. He's got Kenwood at 5'8". He's got Denver at halfback. Then Shane Walker, which is the former Tiger Shane Walker, and Felch as the front rowers with Nathan Brown. And then there's Daniel Wagon, Lance Thompson and Wayne Bartram, with Burns, Pongia, Richards and Hardy. Alright, the Eels are up next. This is my side, so you can give me shit if you want for it, but yeah, we went for a bit of an English flavour. Decided to not protect Dean Pay, which was ultimately not a great idea, but had to try and keep what I had, and I felt like keeping Dimmick was probably, if I had to make my choices again, maybe I'd think of something else, but I'm kind of glad that I kept John Simon, because those halfbacks went so quick and I probably would have been left at pick 18, 17, whatever number it was way back there. Probably would have been left with not much in the halves. So interestingly, I decided to pick up Dean Raber as a backup at the fullback, Chris Lawler as my halfback backup. I got Wes Patton as another halfback backup. I got a bit of halves now. Interesting that I've got Wes Patton. He was just sitting there. Sid Domick was a really good pickup. I thought someone would take him before then, and they didn't. So I ended up with him as a bidder. So that means that what I think the best team is Rod Silver at fullback, Chris Hicks and Ian Heron on the wings, Domick and Kelly in the centres, Jason Smith and John Simon as the halves, and then I've got Kalis and Danny Lee up front with Lee Jackson at hooker, and I've got Highmarsh, Dennis Betts, Jim Dimmick, and then my bench is Dennis Moran, David Woods, Glenn Morrison and Michael Vella. Not even room for Casey Maguire in this side, so this looks pretty stacked to me. I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. So next up is our first of our merged clubs, which is the Gold Coast Crushers. They, as you can see, the retired players for them, there's 20 odd retired players, a lot of players that they had to pick up anyway. So they've retained guys like Preston Campbell and Scott Sattler, so some youth there. Graham Mackay is probably their marquee guy, is kept there. They got some early picks, or they got the earlier picks in some of them, so yeah, some good pickups they got. I ended up giving him Dale Shearer. Like I had to help draft for this one, so Dale Shearer ends up playing for the Crushers and all iterations of the Gold Coast as we can see it. So our best side that I can come up with is Dale Shearer at fullback, Jason Hudson and Graham Mackay in the wings, Carl Lovell and Aaron Mule in the centres, David Miles and Preston Campbell in the halves, with Colin Ward, Jamie Goddard, Michael Hodgson up front, Darren Tracy, Brett Hetherington and Scott Sattler in the back row, and it's Dean Calloway, Brendan Costin, Craig Wilson and Damien Driscoll. Okay, next up is the Knights. So once again we had to do our best to try and draft for them, and I think we've done a pretty damn good job with this. They drafted, it seems to Parramatta focus, but that wasn't actually what was meant. Daniel Gartner's a great pickup for them. So, you know, this was our guy for Newcastle had given me these players to keep, so I obviously didn't touch any of that, didn't do any trading. So we ended up with fullback Robbie O'Davis, and it was Moody and Werrett on the wings, McDougall and Hughes in the centres, with Matthew Andrew Johns as the halves, Glenn Grief, Danny Lima, Danny Padiris as your front row, and then Daniel Gartner, Darren Shaw and Trent Runciman as your back row. Back row's a bit light, but that's okay. And then we've got Teven, Craigie, Fletcher and Pensini. Struggling by the end to try and think who to go put in there, because we have a lot of centres, and he kept 5 centres, so I didn't know what to do with that. And I kind of had to play 2 of them and have one on the bench, and then still have 2 others that, yeah, maybe if I was probably doing it, I probably wouldn't have kept Brett Grogan. I probably would have tried to keep maybe a back rower, but you know, that's what he did. So next up is the Magpies. Some interesting ones that ended up in the bidding. So they got Troy Pizzette, and some interesting like Wayne Clifford, Andrew Mead, Scott Cram. So some guys that sort of very interesting to turn up in this squad. Oh, I don't have a lock. I just realised I didn't fill out the lock properly, so I'm going to have to just quickly do that. You're going to see how this works now. Where's my lock? Well, Langmack's the lock for sure. I just didn't type it in. So you can see how that works. Just fill out your numbers and it goes in. So yeah, some big pickups in the draft. Obviously the biggest one is Ricky Stewart, then Paul Harrigan, Solomon Himono, Matthew Ryan, Stringer and Carlaw are great, and Chris McKenna. That was some excellent drafting. I think there was some real good pickups there. This makes this West Side, I mean, this West Side, if you think about it, 98 wasn't a great year, and 99 was probably the worst team anyone's ever seen. They're going to have this team effectively 2 years. It is a massive improvement on what they basically would have had. So I've gone, because I had to put this one in, unfortunately I didn't have it in time from the drafting guys. So I've said that Leeds is going to start, and we're going to put Hodgson on the bench. So it's going to start with Leeds at fullback, Leo Clark, Adam Donovan as your wingers, Carlaw and Ryan as centres, Adam Doyle at 5'8", and the halfback's Ricky Stewart. Front row is Paul Harrigan, Cherry Mesha and Paul Stringer, with Himono, McKenna and Langmack in the back row. Ron Jones is your utility on the bench with Hodgson, and then there's Scandalis and McMenemy. That's a pretty good side. Next up we've got the Panthers. I had to help with the drafting of this one. Unfortunately our friend Jack Martin was held up at work and couldn't do it, so I think he's going to be pretty happy with what I've done. I kind of screwed Parramatta by taking Dean Pay, but you know, that's the way it works. So yeah, I think Dave Watson's very interesting that he went all the way to the bids and they got him. Got Morvan Edwards and Shane Elford back, and Paul Johnson and Fred Peterson. There's quite a lot of Panthers that kind of came back to them. Some were auto picks and some just were there. So yeah, anyway, I think they picked up really well. Scott Goulay and Michael Withers are pretty good draft picks. McNamara, you know, Panther coming back home or staying at home. Danny Nutley I think is really good for them. Yeah, and Brett Dallas, a lot of speed out at Penrith. So when you look at this side, there's so much speed in this side. Fullbacks Wesser, and then you've got Robbie Beckett and Brett Dallas on the wings, so huge amount of speed there. Ryan Girdle and Shane Elford, no slouches, and then you've got Steve Carter and Greg Alexander. Up front, you've got Dean Pay, Craig Gower, and Danny Nutley, and then you've got Portua, Adamson, and Goulet. So that's pretty impressive. And then your bench is Michael Withers, Talita Livea, and Carl McNamara, and Frank Portua. I did really well on the Pacifica name and did terribly on the Scottish name, so sorry about that. And I mean, we didn't even find room for Scott Donald. You know, there's some other guys here. Brent Drew didn't get a go either, so I think Penrith have done pretty well. Next up is our second of our forced mergers. This is the Perth Mariners. I hope you enjoy my wonderful logo making and jersey making. So that's what they're going to look like. There is some very interesting. Both McGuinness brothers from West have ended up at the Perth Mariners. So we've got a team of brothers because the Guyers are both here as well. And then a bit of a Canberra flavour with Ferner and Nagas, Craig Field, Russell Richardson. That's very good drafting, and Russell Bowden. I kind of like all that drafting. Couple of the Perth guys who were put into the draft came back to him in Evans and Fleming. I think that's a pretty good squad. So the best team that Sean has come up with is Robbie Ross at fullback, then Matt Geyer and Ken Nagas on the wings, Ken McGuinness and Russell Richardson in the centres. Then you've got Scott Hill and Brett Camorley, Robbie Kearns, Richard Swain and Rodney Howe up front, with Paul Marquette, David Ferner and Tyron Smith. That is an awesome forward pack. Craig Field, Mark Geyer, Russell Bowden and Peter Shields. So I think they've got to be pretty up there, this team. There's some real good players in this side. Couldn't even find Kevin McGuinness a spot in the team. So, yeah. Alright, next up we've got the Rabbitohs. So, Rabbitohs start off, this is Kev's team. Some interesting drafting, got Roberts back, got Dale Fritz. There's plenty happening up there, up the front or in the forwards. In terms of players they picked up, there's no one in the, apart from David Lomax, who he actually bid on himself. There's no that much interesting in the bidding. So their best side, fullback is Brendan O'Mara, Garth Wood and Darren Albert are the wingers, Kevin Iro and Tia Rapati are the centres, and you've got 5'8" David Penner, halfback Darryl Trindle, up front is Robert Stonato and McNicholas. The second rowers is Dale Fritz, David Lomax and Bill Peden, with Steve Trindle, Michael Francis, Michael Smith and Craig Wing. So interesting. I'm going to jump across to the Raiders. So the Raiders are one of the teams that had a trade. They picked up John Buttigieg out of that. They interestingly got Lincoln Rodonicus in an auto pick of their bidding. Ben Samet, James Langeloa, some interesting players there. The best 17 is Brett Mullins at fullback, John Hopewadi and Leslie Vanicolo, so the biggest wingers you could possibly think of, with Tony Carroll and Paul McGregor in the centres. Then you've got Laurie Dale with Mark McClendon, Jason Larry, Simon Wolford, Todd Payton, Ruben Wiki, Jason Croker and Bradley Clyde, so good forward pack, and with McFadden, Buttigieg, Wesley and Hughes as your bench. So I'll move on to the Rams. The Rams, interesting side. No one have made major thing in the bids, so we'll just go through the team list. Fullbacks Luke Phillips, and you got Rod Jensen and Matthew Daylight in the wings, Graham Appo and Luke Williams in the centres, Kevin Walters and Mitch Healy as the halves, Corvo, Kerrod Walters and Tukey up front, with Alan Cairn, Kevin Campion and Peter Ryan. And your bench is Kidwell, Peake, Hick and Robbie Simpson. We'll move on to the Roosters. The Roosters are missing a winger. How did I do that? I think I just didn't save it properly. Miles is probably our guy. Sorry about that. There we go. Sorry, I don't know how that happened. Yep, that's right. Okay. So in terms of guys they picked up in the bidding, there's nothing. I mean, Andrew Pearce is a good player. Yeah, Jeff Bell. There's some good players there, but no one that's going to kind of move the dial. But if they were involved in that that trade to get Scott Wilson, actually, I think they probably might have put Scott Wilson on the wing. Either way, we'll leave it how it is for now. So their best 17 is what we've got. Is fullback Ivan Cleary, then they've got Richie Barnett and Robert Miles on the wings, Ryan Cross and Brett Rodwell in the centres, with Brad Fittler and Andrew Lamb in the halves. Then you've got DeVico, Pritis and Cusack up front, with Barnhill, Iro and Ricketson in the back row, Sean Garlick as your utility, Scott Wilson as your back utility. Then you've got Dallas Hood and Brian Fletcher. So interesting side. Next to the Seagulls, and they've all come home apparently. Even the ones who didn't live there before are all come home to the Northern Beaches, including Duncan McGilvray, Nick Zisti, some other guys down here. And so their best 17 is Shadden Nevin at fullback, then Zisti and Duncan on the wings, Terry Hill and Greg Florimo in the centres, Cliff Lyons and Jeff Tuvey in the halves. Then you've got Joe Taylor, Jim Sedaris, Neil Tierney, with Steve Menzies, Peter Jones and Nick Kosef in the back row. And then you've got the Spaghetti Twins, the Skiffaletti and Pinchinelli, with Colella and Anthony Seibold. So that was interesting when he drafted that as the very last draft pick. So there was some interesting thoughts. Okay, next up is the Sharks. Now, the Sharks went and did the same thing they did the last draft. Michael did the same kind of thing. He picked up wingers he picked up Wendell Saylor this time. Last time he picked up Blake Ferguson. I think it was going for a certain type of player, I think. Yeah, but ended up not putting him on the wing anyway. So in terms of other players, Robert Tocco, Andrew Carriage, so that's Paul Carriage's brother, ended up being put on that one. Glenn Eyre, so some interesting players there. So the best 17 is David Peach at fullback, with Matt Rogers and Brett Howland on the wings, Andrew Eddingshausen in the centres with Wendell Saylor, Adam Dykes and Noel Goldthorpe as the halves, with Martin Lang, Shane Walker and Barry Ward up front, Craig Greenfield, Sean Ryan and Tawera Nickhow as the back row, Dallas Weston, Nick Graham, Matt Parsons and Matt Bickerstaff is the bench. Next is the Steelers. The Steelers picked up Matt Gaffer, which was an interesting rookie, and yeah, Philly Siru. Some auto picks didn't give them too much interesting, but yeah, alright, so their best side, fullback is Luke Patton, the two wingers Rod Wishart and Matt Singh, the centres Sean Timmins and Tony Martin, so that's a pretty impressive back five. The halves Trent Barrett and Paul Green, that's also very impressive. Up front they've got Hermanson, Steve Walters, Craig Smith, and then they've got Fitzgibbon, Logan Swan and Brad Mackay in the back row. Andrew Purcell, Andrew Hart, Justin Dooley and Chris Lightfall on their bench. So that's a very strong side. Next up we've got the Storm. So this is a completely new Storm side. We're not going to get anything the same. So there's no one protected. All these Blues, all the drafted. So there's 20 drafts. They got, that's Stephen Price. That's not Steve Price, the Canterbury player. That's a different player. That's a 5'8". Lee Hopkins is an interesting one with poaching. Yeah. Alright, so their best side is Matt Sears at fullback, Nandruku and Caruana on the wings, Danny Moore and Jason Sinclair in the centres, Andrew Walker at 5'8", Alan Langer at halfback. Then you got Lazarus, Soden and Carroll up front, Kennedy, Larson and Norton as the back row. Then they've got John Doyle, Nigel Gaffey, Harvey Howard and Mitch Newton. That team is very, very good. Next up is the Tigers. So this is Big T's side. I did my best with it, with the list that he kind of gave me. The very interesting one I find is that the auto pick gave them Michael Maguire. So I didn't do that. It just picked it itself. Andrew Tangata-Toa, Mark Shipway, they're both very interesting players to pick up. Robert Mears is a good one. Bubba Kennedy stays there at the Tigers, so very interesting. The best 17 is Tim Brash at fullback with Sean Hoppy and Daryl Halligan on the wings, Michael Butner and David McLean in the centres, Glenn Hughes at 5'8", Steve Georgalis at halfback. Then you're up front, Adam Starr, Darren Centre, Jim Gadden. The back row is Sirenen, O'Neill and Tangata Toa, with Dudley, Milford, Parsons and Hudson Smith as the bench. So the last side is the Warriors. The Warriors got, we had a Parramatta fan doing the Warriors, so that's probably why Matthew Spencer's there. That's probably why he's drafted Aaron Raper and Jared McCracken. Interestingly, Marcus Bai for the Warriors is a really good pickup. Michael Gillette's great as well. Some other guys like Icemonger and Duckworth, and yeah. So their best 17 is Matthew Ridge at fullback, Odin Ryan and Bai on the wings, Kraken and Timo in the centres, Michael Gillette, Stacey Jones as the half 5'8", Vangana, Raper and CUCU up front with Lau, TD, Carney and Cross in the back row. Then they've got Guttenbill, Nullivar, Madison and Adam Hayden. So yeah, very, very interesting. That is all the team lists, so I hope you've enjoyed the draft, and I will be giving updates as I do them for the mock season, so hopefully you'll enjoy that as well. And yeah, see you guys.